Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Eric Poulin. I'm your host. My guest this evening is Owen Hill, and Owen is a longtime activist and socialist. He ran for the state senate in Portland in 2014 as Green Party candidate, and his writing has appeared in Jacobin Magazine and Socialist Worker. He is currently the Portland branch organizer of the International Socialist Organization, which meets every Wednesday on the USM campus from 7 to 9 p.m. Welcome to the Soapbox, Owen.
Hey, Eric. Glad to be here.
All right, Owen, I invited you on the show because, as you and many Americans are very well aware of, a socialist is sort of rising in prominence in America. And so I thought we've done a few shows here on the Soapbox about socialism in America at this moment, but things are rapidly changing. And so I thought it might be interesting to have you come in and talk a little bit about socialism. So why don't we start with, how would you define socialism? Because, you know, an article just recently came out in The Guardian really pointing out that, for example, Bernie Sanders, sort of the standard bearer in America at the moment for socialism, would really be considered center-right in Europe. Yeah. So what makes one socialist? What is socialism at this point?
Yeah, well, I think, to me, Eric, I think it's a complicated question, in part because the history of the socialist movement is so rich and so varied. It really spans a whole number of different currents, a number of different political ideas, a number of conceptions about how we make change, what kind of change we're seeking to make. So it's tough to pin down, a singular definition of socialism. I think, I would describe Sanders' idea of socialism as more of a social democracy, which I think is what most people think of when they think of socialism. They think of Sweden or they think of Denmark, that kind of thing.
Well, most people maybe around the world, but in America, don't you think most people, at least up until recently, when they heard socialism, they thought Russia and China,
sure,
communism,
no, it's
totalitarianism.
I think that was definitely the thing that was pounded into the brains of Americans for the last 100 years. But today, that's those examples are no longer relevant. No one talks about the Soviet Union much anymore. It's not existed for some 20 years, and certainly very few people, I think, except the most, I don't know. I think very, very few members of the left look towards China as anything approaching a socialist country today.
Right. Well, and even in the mainstream culture, I think there seems to be a generational shift. I mean, I think as we're getting further and further away from the Cold War, people are less encumbered by their preconceptions of socialism that had been associated with it. Are you optimistic that there is a genuine sea change happening? And if so, is it Bernie Sanders that's bringing this about, or is he a symptom of it?
I think it's a bit of both. I think that Sanders has crystallized something that was already happening in the consciousness of Americans all over the country, really for the last 15 years, and even, you can go back before then. There was a major global justice movement in the 1990s that got cut short by 2001, September 11th, and then the drive to war. But since then, I think there's been an increasingly, people have started to shift back leftward, ordinary working class people. And I think especially around the economic crisis starting in 2008, we've seen more and more of that. We've seen Occupy, we've seen the uprising in Wisconsin, now the Black Lives Matter movement, before then the fights for justice for Trayvon Martin, the fight for, so many other people. So I think there's been this leftward movement in American politics, and I think what Sanders' contribution has really been is to kind of crystallize that around the word socialism, which I think is a very, very good thing, and is a huge opportunity for socialists like myself to get out there and talk about socialism, as well as to talk about the different strands of socialism, because I would not put myself in exactly the same strand. I don't have exactly the same strand of politics as Sanders does. I consider my tradition to be socialism from below, which I would counterpose to socialism from above, which I think is part of the politics of the Sanders campaign.
And is that characteristic of social democracy in Europe as well?
Yep, absolutely. As well as, I think it's actually the dominant trend of, socialist, of the socialist currents throughout the world is the idea that, that socialism will come from people above, right? That people either are electing the right person to be in parliament or, imposing if it's the communist, regimes, imposing the right regime that will bring socialism, or that, a band of guerrillas armed with guns can go and impose socialism on the country. I think that tends to be the dominant politics of the socialist current. But I think that there's a real history of socialism from below, the idea that ordinary working class people can fight for and win their own self-liberation.
So, Professor Richard D. Wolff has been on the show. He's a Marxist economist. He's been on the show at least 2 times now. And, he advocates democracy in the workplace, which was something that was really popular back in the movements in the 30s and 40s as well. The labor question about how to institute more democracy in the workplace and get workers to have more say over their work lives. Is that representative of socialism from below? Is that what you mean when you say that?
Yeah. I think that's I would have maybe some difference of vision with Dr. Wolff about how exactly we get there. But I think that the general premise is that that socialism and democracy need to be merged, that the fight for economic inequality can't be separated from the fight for political and economic democracy.
Yeah, I think that's where his argument has the most juice, where he's really sort of redefining or recasting, not redefining, but recasting socialism in the eyes of people as a fundamentally democratic approach, more so than its, erstwhile competitor capitalism, which is fundamentally undemocratic in its structures of the economy.
Yeah, and I would say, too, that's going back to Karl Marx, Marx, became political fighting for democracy, fighting for political democracy. He lived in Germany, a country that was ruled by, a king or a prince, or, it was broken up into hundreds of little tiny princedoms and fiefdoms. And he saw himself in the tradition of the French Revolution, fighting for fraternity, equality, and democracy. And what he ran into was the challenges that the class forces that had made the French Revolution, the bourgeoisie, a rising capitalist class who was interested in rationalizing the economy and democratizing the politics, wasn't really interested in doing that anymore, that they had started to retreat from those positions because they were facing in France and in England rising working class fights, people going on strike, Chartists in England organizing for the vote, so they had started to become afraid of democracy. And so really what broke Marx from that tradition was engaging with trying to win democracy in Germany, in his country, and running into the limits of the previous social force and asking what social force existed that could bring about democracy today. And he gravitated towards the working class as the key agent for doing that.
So let me ask you just a historical question, and it might be a little naive, but did socialism exist prior to Marx?
Yeah, so I think different strands of socialism existed prior to Marx, absolutely. And he draws on a bunch of different currents of thought that were pre-existing. But what he does, the synthesis that he makes, is, again, that synthesizing democracy and economics, and the idea that economic equality needed to be linked to political and economic democracy. And that was his contribution. And it was a very important one, and one that hadn't been made before him.
So let's jump back for a second. You said you disagree with Dr. Wolff in terms of how to bring about socialism from below. He seems to feel that it has to happen in the workplace, and we reorganize the structures of the economy. How do you differ from that? Where do you disagree?
And I would say, I think it's a hair's breadth in a lot of ways. I think our positions are very close. I do think that Wolff tends to overemphasize a little bit workers' cooperatives, and not that workers' cooperatives aren't really good and great living examples of what it means for ordinary working class people to run their workplaces. But I just think that they have limits, and there's only, that there are structures, that the structures of the market and the imperatives of competition in the market limit any democracy that can happen at even the most democratic workplace. I think my workplace is a great example. I think my job is awesome. I work with great people, and it's an environment which is very horizontal in a lot of ways, probably more so than anywhere else I've ever worked. But the reality of the market means that we have to compete, and that limits what decisions we can make, what our pay can be, what hours we have to work. All those things are limited by structural necessity of the market.
So then how do we, given that, how do we get to a point of having socialism from below?
Yeah, I think, Sanders has talked about it. He's talked about political revolution, and he's even gone as far as talking about social revolution. Mm-hmm. And I think social revolution is what we need to be talking about, that collectively, through mass movements, through mass strikes and mass protests, that we actually can achieve the power to reorganize our society, and to really go down into the roots of how society operates, and turn the world upside down.
So, social democracy is sort of an ideology that is more or less compatible with free markets, competitive markets. Mm-hmm. Is socialism fundamentally incompatible? Can you have, like you were saying, that level of competition but still have socialism from below?
I don't think you can have markets and still have socialism from below, because markets are about what can people, what's the competitive way that people can make money off of a thing. And it gets a little abstract to talk about it, but to me, socialism is like not who makes money, but like what do we as humans need to live, and how do we as humans, working in a workplace, living in a community, how do we want to structure our lives? And so removing the question of profit and profitability from why we do what we do, and instead recentering the question of human need, human necessity, and human experience.
Okay, so that sounds a little utopian. So what are the first steps to getting there? Is a Sanders victory, let's say, where he sort of redefines the political landscape in America, is that a step on the path towards where you want to go?
I think it's a step on the path as long as socialists are clear about what Sanders stands for and what he doesn't stand for, and that people like myself who want to achieve a fully liberated society keep that goal in front and center. That we work with the people who are supporting Bernie Sanders, who are fighting for all the right things, all those fights that will move us closer to a goal of a liberated society, to get the market out of the necessities of our daily lives. That we work with those people and then make the argument that it's not enough to just restrict the market. We actually have to, remove it.
So I recently read a Jacobin article about how Sanders can win, potentially, and how he's essentially more electable than Hillary Clinton. Jacobin seems to have come out more or less in support of Sanders, with some reservations, I think. Socialist Worker, the other publication you've written for, is not so much in Sanders' favor. They are much more critical in terms of him running in the Democratic Party,
right,
as a lot of leftists are. I guess, where do you fall on that debate that is really a pretty hot one on the left right now, it seems like?
Yeah. I mean, so I think, my argument is that I don't think that the Democratic Party will ever be a tool in the hands of working class people to fight for our own interests. And that, people have many times, the left in America has attempted to turn the Democratic Party into a tool for our side. And every single time they've been rebuffed. They tried it in the 1930s. They tried it in the 1960s. They tried it in the 1970s and 80s. They tried it in the 2000s with the anti-war movement. And instead, what the Democratic Party has done, it's channeled, pacified, and co-opted movements for social change, and brought them into an arena that's safe for the interests of big business.
Okay, so has there ever been one of the big parties, whether it was the Republican Party at the time of the Civil War, or the Democratic Party, or even Theodore Roosevelt's Republican Party, or FDR's Franklin Roosevelt's Democratic Party? Has there ever been a time when there was a major party in America that was sufficiently accommodating to radicalism in any sort of effective way in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the Republican Party of the Civil War is the best example. The Civil War was a tremendous event in the history of this country. And when you talk about social revolution, you should keep in mind it's happened twice in America. And one of those times was the Civil War, when slaves were, liberated themselves, forced their liberation on a Republican Party, which ended up, in some ways being dragged along, but in some ways going out and meeting them. And you just hear the most phenomenal stories about freed slaves during the period of Reconstruction, before a deal was cut and that was put to an end. Before the social force that was part of the democratic revolution of the Civil War became afraid of that democracy and decided to cut its ties with it.
Mm-hmm. You are listening to the Soapbox on WMPG. I am your host, Eric Poulin. My guest this evening is Owen Hill, activist and organizer for the Socialist Party.
The International Socialist Organization.
Excuse me. So I wanted to ask you about that because is there a socialist party, like a Democrat and Republican, or would you say it's more a descriptor of one's ideology, like quote unquote liberal or conservative?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reality is there's a organization called the Socialist Party. It's not it's not the Socialist Party of Eugene Debs. Okay. It's very small. I don't have much of a relationship with it. I think there isn't really. At the end of the day, there isn't a socialist party in the United States. Mm-hmm. And you have to understand the history of the left trying to take over the Democratic Party if you want to understand why there isn't a socialist party in the United States today. And the fact that that's one of the key weaknesses of the American working class.
Yeah, and it's been a challenge, as you say, going back for quite some time, for the left to mount legitimately a viable threat to the status quo, the system as it mm-hmm. exists. And they've tried to do it through the Democratic Party, as you say, and they've failed. Maybe that's been the problem. But Chris Hedges, in his recent article for Truthdig, Bernie Sanders' phantom movement, was by and large very critical of Sanders, but also critical of the Green Party and the left to a lesser extent as well. He said, maybe not to a lesser extent. He says, quote, "The left is broken and disorganized. The two parties have created innumerable obstacles to third parties, from locking them out to the debates and challenging voter lists and keeping them off the ballot." So obviously blaming the major party structure there. But he says the Green Party is internally crippled by endemic factionalism and dysfunction. It is dominated in many states by an older white demographic that is trapped in the nostalgia of the 1960s and narcissistically self-referential. So I guess my question coming out of that is, that's pretty tough on the Green Party. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like they have done the most work and have been the most successful in terms of organizing on the left and posing a threat as a viable third party. But if they're still able to be described in that way, shouldn't we be focusing on reforming the Democratic Party as Sanders seems to be doing? Or if not, how do we get mm-hmm. to the place of having a viable third party?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a good question. One, I think, I just do want to say I think Hedges' characterization of the Green Party doesn't entirely match my experience. Okay. In the times I've worked with the organization. I think that here in Portland, I think we have a good, solid network of people who are committed green activists. There certainly are divisions. There certainly are political questions that come out that were never really settled inside the organization. But I think that Hedges maybe goes a little bit too far, I would say. And in terms of how we get there, we got to start moving there. And we got to start, moving towards viable socialist parties, viable third parties, an eco-socialist, a green socialist party. I think we got to start moving there. And we do that one step at a time. I think for a good example of how not to do that, I think Hedges' piece, I think he's right about a lot of stuff. But the tone of that article, I think, is off the wall. It's not something that's actually going to connect with all the people who are so excited about Bernie Sanders for all the right reasons. That people are so excited right now. And the role of the left is not to be the crank in the corner saying, what's wrong with you people? Nothing is ever going to change. The role of the left is to engage with those people in a serious way and say, what is it really going to take to win a political revolution? Mm-hmm. What is it going to take to win $15 an hour? Because even if the best case scenario happens, even if Bernie Sanders wins, that's not going to be enough. That's not what it takes. That's not what won us the New Deal in the 1930s. We didn't win unemployment insurance, the right to a union, the 8-hour day. We didn't win those things just because Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president. We won those things because people struck for them. Mm-hmm. We won those things because people fought pitched battles, against the, against the employers, hired goons, against the police, on strike lines and picket lines. People fought for those things, and they fought in a real and serious way. And that's what it's going to take.
Well, and I think Bernie Sanders would be the first to admit that. I mean, he says repeatedly in his stump speech that, he says, you can elect me, but I can't do anything on my own. Mm-hmm. This political revolution that he constantly refers to and the movement that he's attempting to mobilize, he insists people would need to remain engaged. They would need to hold their elected officials accountable in a way that really we have not been willing to do in generations. Mm-hmm. So do you see, do you see, because I mean, obviously you're right about the 30s and 40s and socialists and communists were instrumental in organizing and pushing for those reforms that you mentioned. Do you see those types of movements coming out of the Sanders movement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things that's most exciting about this. There's a poll recently that 1 out of every 10 college freshmen are looking to be involved in protests on their campus. That's huge. Mm-hmm. That's actually more than it was, I think, in the mid 1960s. So that's a lot right there, and that's an excited generation. And I do think that Sanders, that message is also similar to what Obama said. What will that mean for him organizationally after the election?
Right.
That's an open question, but I think certainly we want to say, yes, that's absolutely correct. That's why you need to join a socialist organization. Mm-hmm. That's why you need to, organize a Fight for 15 committee at your college. That's why you need to go out there and do things and make connections and read theory and read history and start to build those groups and those networks that are actually going to win us the things we need.
Well, to Sanders' credit, he's been pretty upfront about criticizing Obama for dropping the ball on that promise. I mean, you're right. Obama did, give the impression that he was going to take all of this unprecedented support that he mobilized, this new coalition, the Obama coalition, and then use them to bring about more change once he was in office. But he effectively turned his back on them, gave all their information to the DNC, which, he's been roundly criticized for on the left, and then abandoned them and basically said, okay, I got it from here. But Sanders has been critical of that and has said that he wouldn't do that. Remains to be seen how exactly he would continue to do that. What do you say to the people, Owen, that... I think there are some disaffected radicals from the 60s, and then there are some progressive-minded people today who would say protests can only do so much. We've tried protests. You really need to pull the levers from within the system.
One thing, a protest can only do so much. But a protest is different than a movement, and a protest is different than a strike. Mm-hmm. And if you want to look at the things that were most effective, that won us everything we had, by and large, it was not working from within the system. It was organizing the kinds of movements, mass militant movements, that can organize working people in their millions to go out there and to fight with whatever capacity they have, whether that's going on strike, whether that's organizing a sit-in. There's a story about a group of janitors, unorganized janitors, who are fighting for a union contract out in Minneapolis, who, they organize, not only are they on strike, but they've started blocking traffic now. Mm-hmm. It's like, that's how you win stuff. Mm-hmm. You not only are you withholding your labor, you're also then saying, I'm not just going to withhold my labor. I'm going to even go further. I'm going to prevent the system from operating. That,
I think, is such an interesting tactic. And I've participated in some marches here in Portland that block traffic. Mm-hmm. And so I have an answer to this question, but I want to ask you, Why? How is that effective? How does that persuade people? Because I think people are put out by that and get irritated by it. How is that an effective tactic in your mind?
Yeah, no, people do get, I think it can frustrate some of the people on the road, and, my sympathies are with them in some ways. But, I think what it does is it forces the system, it forces people. It's disruptive enough that it forces the everyday to stop for a minute and ask people to consider, what this injustice is happening. And, if people think, getting stuck in traffic is an injustice, ask them to really look at what's happening to working class people all over the country. Ask them to look at the rates of police murder on the streets, police murder of black and brown people. Ask them to look at our criminal justice system and then to say, is that also unjust, and is it more unjust? But it is a risk, and that's why I think, again, it can't be a mass movement only, and it can't be a militant movement only. It has to be a mass militant movement. We have to have our sights on winning over the majority of working class people, and so you got to be a little bit thoughtful. You got to be thoughtful about when you do disruptions, how you do disruptions, that kind of thing.